In this episode, we're going to go over how to cope with the fear of failure in high-stakes moments. Hey there, I'm Eli Straw, mental performance coach and the founder of SuccessStartsWithin.com. Whenever you have a high-stakes moment during games, if you experience fear in these moments, this might be why you find yourself choking and underperforming in these big situations. But why is it that fear is increased during these moments? And most importantly, how is it that this fear actually lowers your performance during big moments in games? Well, the fear is formed because it's a big moment. And so because it's a big moment, there are more consequences or perceived consequences if you mess up. Right? So a prime example is it's at the end of the game, game's tied, you're up to the free throw line. Okay, well, if you're up to the free throw line at the end of the game with the game tied, that's a pretty big moment. And if you miss those two free throws, pretty much feels like you ended up losing your team the game if the other team scores a basket and then you all lose, right? If you make those free throws, you are the hero. So we see that free throw feels like it has more of an impact on the outcome of the game. And at that moment, it does because that's the moment you're in. But there are so many other moments, so many other free throws throughout the game that could have led to a different score at that point. But the truth is, in these big moments during games, in these high stakes moments, right, the consequence is either sweeter or more painful. Another example is you're up to bat at the end of the game in softball, and it's a close game, tied game, you're down by one run, and you're up to bat with a runner on second, and you feel like, okay, this is a big moment. If I hit her in, we're going to be tied or we're going to win. If I strike out, I'll let my team down. So we see fear form in these high-stakes moments because these high-stakes moments feel more important. And they are very important at that time. There's no way for us to trick ourselves into thinking, oh, this high-pressure moment, this high-stakes moment isn't important. It is. But we also have to recognize that it's the importance that we place on it that forms the fear. Now, why is it that this fear holds you back? When you find yourself afraid of making mistakes, so you are afraid of failing in these high-stakes moments, one of two things will happen. Either A, you will really want to perform well to the point where you press and you force wanting to play well, or B, you will be so afraid of messing up in this moment that you find yourself hesitating and playing timidly. Now, in high-stakes moments, more often than not, I see the first of those two options happen, where you're wanting to do well so badly because it's a big moment that you force the outcome, or you try to force the outcome at least. Now, what happens, when we try to force outcomes? What do you think? Do you end up performing in the flow? Do we perform naturally, at ease, our best? No. When we try to press and force things to happen, that's where we take ourselves out of the rhythm of the game. We're taking ourselves out of our natural flow. And we end up performing with more stress, more pressure, and more tension, right? And it's not going to be a recipe for doing your best in these moments. So if you are experiencing fear in these high-stakes situations, that fear is coming from the fact that it's a very important moment during the game, and so the consequence feels even more important. Because that consequence is so important, because the moment itself is important to the outcome of the game, it's easy to try and press and force yourself to play well, which typically only causes you to underperform. So what can you do to cope with this fear in these high-stakes moments? Well, the idea is we are working to keep things simple, and I have 3 tips for you that you can use to help. Tip number 1 is make sure that you don't force. So I just said that the major reason why this fear causes you to underperform in these high stakes and big moments during games is because you try to force the outcome that you want. If you want to perform well in these moments, if you want to manage this fear, you have to let go of that idea of forcing. An example of this is a golfer who's played really well on the front 9, and now it's on the back 9 and she is tied for first place in the tournament. As she goes throughout the back 9, what ends up happening is with each shot and with each hole, she becomes more tense and tense and tense, simply because she's trying to force good shots. Now, as she tries to force these good shots, because the shots become more important, the holes become more important because she's doing well, she's tied, maybe she goes up by 1 stroke, down by 1 stroke, but she's really in the mix for first place. So she starts to feel like every shot is more important, and as they get closer and closer to the 18th hole, she starts to press more and more. But as she starts to press and her shots become more tense, she starts to mishit the ball. She's swinging with more tension, and she's trying to force a good swing instead of just allowing it to happen and swinging naturally and swinging smoothly like she was on the front nine. And so as she starts to swing with tension, she starts mishitting balls, and so she slowly falls out of first place, and she ends up finishing the round in 5th place simply because she was trying to force that result. What she would have wanted to do differently is on that back nine, trying to treat it like she did the front nine, right? And the way that she would treat it like she did the front nine was trying not to force anything, just letting go and allowing it to happen, keeping things simple for herself. So how can you use this idea within your game in these big moments when you feel fear? Well, first and foremost, it does come down to the idea of just reminding yourself that you don't want to force it. The way that we let go of these outcomes is by focusing on the moment that you're in. And that's what the next 2 tips really help you with. But it begins with this idea of saying, hey, I'm not going to force it, and also recognizing that trying to force these outcomes only holds you back. So what I would recommend you do is that when you are in these big moments, you try to remind yourself that forcing will only cause you to underperform. The more you try to force the outcome you want, the less likely you are to actually get that outcome. So yes, it's a big moment. Yes, you are experiencing fear of messing up in this moment, but trying to force it isn't going to help at all. So you have to let go of that idea of forcing and turn your attention onto the process, and specifically the routines of your performance. And that brings me to tip number 2. You want to trust your routines. Routines in sports are, really the foundation of consistency, whether it's routines throughout the week, whether it is your nutritional routine, whether it's your pregame routine, whether it's a pre-shot routine, a pre-drive routine, simply something you think before a play within a game, that can be considered a routine. But there are so many things out of your control as an athlete. And since there are so many things out of your control, it's even more important that you focus on what is within your control. What is within your control are the routines that you want to stick to. An example of trusting your routines or not necessarily trusting your routines in big moments comes from a tennis player. So this tennis player, whenever it gets to be a match point, really struggles with his serve. During these match point moments or even game points, he struggles with his serve because he starts to put more pressure on himself since this is a big moment. Even if he's ahead, right? Even if he's winning by a few points, he still finds himself pressing for these serves. Then what happens if he faults on the first serve, he really stresses for that second serve, and his percentage goes way down for actually having a good serve. So what's really changing for these match point and game point serves for him? Well, he has a really good routine or pre-serve routine before every single serve throughout the match and throughout the games. But when it comes to these crunch moments, right, these moments where it's match point or game point, he tends to go away from his normal routine simply because he forgets about it, because he's focusing so much instead on wanting to win the point. So his mind has gone from focusing on the process of his serve and focusing on the routine of his serve to thinking about what will happen if he wins the serve, right? If he aces the serve, he wins the point, how excited he'll be if that actually happens. So he goes away from his routine. But as he goes away from his routine, what happens is he's not approaching the serve in the same way that he does all his other serves. And if you're really used to doing something one way within your game, so for this tennis player, since he's used to serving one certain way in terms of his prep and his routine, what do you think happens when he goes away from that? When he goes away from that, he's no longer as comfortable, he's no longer as confident, and so he ends up hitting it a little bit differently. He ends up hitting it softer sometimes. He tries to place it a little bit too much, which never works out for him. So he goes away from his routine. However, if he can stick to his routine, which this is an example from a tennis player that I have worked with, and what we got him to do was actually stick to his routine. And so what ended up happening was, as he stuck to his routine for game points and match points, his percentage of winning serves went up. The reason that it went up was because he was approaching these just like any other serve during the game or during the match, and he was a really good server, but he wasn't allowing himself to trust that serve during these points because he was going away from his routine. So how can you use this idea for yourself? Well, going back to the last tip, I said you don't want to force it. The way that you don't force it in these big moments is by not deviating from what you normally do, right? So that tennis player, he wanted to stick with his pre-serve routine no matter the situation within the game. The golfer that I was talking about in the last example, she wants to stick to her pre-shot routine and her pre-putting routine no matter what hole she's on, no matter what shot she's on, no matter what the situation is within the round. She wants to stick to her routines. So you want to think for yourself, what are the routines that you have within your game? Do you have pre-shot routines, pre-point routines, pre-drive routines? Even just like I said earlier, even just simply something you tell yourself and think before the moment happens within the game. But get clear on what the routines are that you use throughout the game, and then stick with those in these big moments. Don't try to do anything new, do anything special, change anything. You do not need to change anything, because the moment or the situation and actions themselves within that moment are the same, right? For the golfer, it's the same situation within the game. She's had many putts, many chip shots, many tee shots throughout the round. For the tennis player, it's the same serve that he has throughout the entire game, the entire match. The only thing that changes is the circumstances surrounding that moment in terms of the score and how much time is left within the game, the round, or the match. But we do not need to change the way we approach these situations simply because the situation seems more important. In fact, if you change the way you approach the situation, this is where you see yourself trying to force it and underperforming. So get very clear on what are the routines within your game, and then figure out how can I stick to these routines even during these big moments when I feel fear. And then tip number 3 is you need to focus on how you win. So what does it mean to focus on how you win? Well, let's think about these big moments. So these big moments are important moments. They are high stakes moments because we feel like they have a bigger impact on the result and the outcome of the performance. And they very well may, right? They very well may have more of an impact, especially since, that's the moment you're in. So if I go back to the example I gave earlier about the basketball player shooting free throws, yes, at that moment, when the game is tied, if that basketball player makes the free throws, their team has a better chance of winning. If they miss the free throws, maybe the other team has a better chance of winning. So these big moments, they are very important at that moment in the game, right? We are not trying to gloss over that. But when something is more important for you, does it make more sense to focus on the fact that you really want it, or focus more on how you get it? It makes more sense to focus on how you get it more so than focusing on the fact that you want it, because you only need to tell yourself once that you want it, but now you need to pay attention to actually how it happens, right? How do you make that happen? How do you get yourself to make the free throw, to hit the shot, to hit the winning serve, right? How do you do those things? That's what you need to be focused on. And that's what it means for you to focus on how you win. An example of this comes from a runner. Now, this runner is a cross-country runner. And he was experiencing a lot of fear and a lot of underperforming when he would get to a certain point within a race. And he would see his pace. And when he saw his pace, he found himself slowing down due to fear that he wouldn't be able to keep up his pace. The reason that he would be feeling this fear is because he would think about where he wanted to finish, what he wanted his time to be. And so he would start to become afraid of not achieving that result, not achieving that outcome. As he and I talked and we worked together, the one thing that we got him to do was recognize that yes, he wants to finish with a certain time, right? Yes, he wants to finish at a certain placing within the race. But that only happens if he sticks to his pace throughout the race. So instead of having his pace lead to fear for him, he thought about how he needed to win ahead of time, and then he stuck to that pacing. And he really worked on letting go of this fear and instead focusing on the pace that he needed to run in order to do well. When he made that simple shift from thinking, well, I really want to get this certain time, I really want to do well, what will happen if I don't do well? When he let go of that and shifted his mindset onto, okay, how do I do well? Will I race well by focusing on this specific pace and keeping this pace up? He ended up getting a personal best on a course simply because of that shift. Now, that shift is something I see in a lot of athletes who start performing better during these high-stakes moments. Not because they're doing anything new, but simply because they are altering their focus. They are giving more attention to how they win, how they perform well, instead of focusing solely on the fact that they want to perform well. So how can you apply this to yourself within your own game? Well, when you're in these high-stakes moments, when you're feeling pressure to perform your best, you have to remind yourself how you perform your best. And it could be as simple as asking yourself the question, okay, how can I control that, right? Or how can I put myself in the best position to perform well? If you ask yourself, how do I put myself in the best position to perform well? Immediately you start to think about the process of your game, what you can control in the moment that will lead to greater chances of playing your best, instead of stressing and trying to force that outcome that you want. You know, of course you want an outcome in these pressure moments. We know that that's there. We know it's a goal that you have, but simply wanting a goal like that isn't going to change the fact in the moment that you need to play well. In fact, if you do focus solely on that, that's where we see that forcing we were talking about earlier take place, where you try to press and force that certain outcome instead of putting attention where attention needs to be, which is on the controllable process elements of your game in that moment that will lead to the result that you want. So make sure that you get clear on what is the process of your game, what do you need to do to help yourself win, and then focus on that in these high-stakes pressure moments. In summary, the fear of failure happens in these high-stakes moments because these high-stakes moments seem more important. And because they seem more important and the consequences are more important, it's really easy to start pressing and trying to force yourself to play well. But instead of trying to force yourself to play well, you want to let go of that outcome. Don't try to force it. Stick to your routines and trust your routines. And lastly, remember how you play your best. Focus on the process, controllable parts of your game. If you're interested in learning more about one-on-one mental performance coaching or any of the sports psychology programs that I have available, I've put links to those in the description below, or you can head over to successstartswithin.com to learn more. Thank you for watching the video, and I wish you the best of success in all that you do.